The thunder of helicopter rotors drowning out morning birdsong should have been Mayor James Washington's first warning that this Tuesday would shatter everything he'd built over 15 years in public service. Instead, he stood at his office window on the third floor of City Hall, coffee mug halfway to his lips, watching armored personnel carriers roll down Main Street like mechanical beasts claiming territory. The National Guard had arrived in Millbrook before dawn, transforming his quiet city of 40,000 into what looked like a war zone. "Sir, you need to see this." Deputy Chief Martinez burst through his office door without knocking, her usually composed demeanor cracked with urgency. She thrust her tablet toward him, the screen displaying a breaking news banner. Domestic terror threat militants allegedly housed in City Hall basement. James set down his mug with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against his desk like a countdown timer. "What militants? Rosa, what basement?" His voice carried the steady authority that had won him 3 elections. But his pulse hammered against his collar. "We don't even have a basement. The building sits on a concrete slab." The tablet screen flickered to live footage of soldiers establishing a perimeter around the building. Rosa's face had gone pale beneath her professional mask. The 911 call came in at 5:30 this morning. Anonymous tip claimed armed insurgents were meeting in our basement, planning attacks on federal facilities. The caller said she witnessed weapons being moved in under cover of darkness. James moved to the window again, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Below, civilians hurried along sidewalks while keeping wide berths from the military vehicles. Shop owners stood in doorways, confusion etched across their faces as they watched their familiar streets transform into something from a news report about distant conflicts. The morning sun caught the barrel of a rifle as a soldier positioned himself behind a concrete barrier, and James felt ice form in his stomach. "Pull the building blueprints," he said, his mind already racing through implications. "Get them to whoever's running this operation. Show them we don't have a basement. Get our facilities manager down here to confirm the foundation specs." He turned from the window, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. "And find out who made that call." 2 hours earlier, before the helicopters and armored vehicles, before the evacuation orders and media vans, Mayor James Washington had been reviewing budget proposals in the pre-dawn quiet of his home office. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, classical music drifting from his wife Sandra's studio upstairs, where she prepared for her morning art classes. This ritual of solitude before the day's demands had sustained him through council battles, budget crises, and the constant navigation required of being the city's first black mayor. His phone had buzzed with a text from his chief of staff. "Early morning, light schedule, budget review at 9, ribbon cutting at noon, community forum at 7. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested he'd spend the day defending himself against accusations of harboring domestic terrorists. Sandra had appeared in his doorway, painter's apron already dusted with charcoal, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in the practical bun she wore for work. "You're up early, even for you," she'd observed, patting to his desk to kiss his forehead. Her fingers smelled of coffee and the lavender hand cream she favored. "Budget season waits for no one," he'd replied, pulling her down for a proper kiss. "What's your schedule looking like? Still teaching that watercolor workshop?" 10 eager retirees ready to paint their hearts out. "Mrs. Henderson swears she's going to master perspective this week." Sandra's laugh had filled the quiet room like music. "What time will you be home?" Should be reasonable. Community forum tonight. But it's just routine neighborhood concerns. Potholes and parking meters. How naive those words seemed now. With military personnel surrounding his workplace, and news helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures. The transformation from normalcy to chaos had begun with Karen Whitfield's phone call to 911. though James wouldn't learn her identity for several more hours. At exactly 5:30 that morning, while James reviewed line items for the Parks Department, Karen had dialed emergency services from her car parked 3 blocks from City Hall. 911. What's your emergency? I need to report a domestic terrorism threat. I've witnessed armed militants entering the basement of City Hall. They're planning attacks on federal buildings. Karen's voice, practiced and urgent, carried just the right tremor of fear mixed with civic duty. Ma'am, can you provide your location and name? I can't give my name. These people are dangerous. I saw them moving weapons and ammunition into the building's basement around 3 a.m. Military-style rifles, boxes of supplies. They're meeting down there right now, planning something terrible. The dispatcher, following protocol for credible terror threats, had initiated immediate escalation procedures. Within minutes, calls had gone out to the FBI field office, state police, and National Guard Command. The machinery of emergency response had begun turning with the inexorable force of a boulder rolling downhill, gathering momentum that would prove nearly impossible to stop. Karen had ended the call and driven home to her colonial-style house on Elm Street, where she prepared coffee and checked news websites, waiting for the story to break. She'd calculated the timing perfectly, early enough to catch officials off guard, late enough to ensure maximum media coverage during the morning news cycle. Now, standing in his besieged office, James watched Rosa coordinate with federal agents, while his phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, city council members, and increasingly panicked constituents. Each conversation followed the same surreal script. No, he had no knowledge of any militants. No. City Hall had no basement. No. He couldn't explain why someone would make such a claim. Mr. Mayor, I need you to evacuate the building immediately. The voice belonged to Agent Collins, FBI, whose intense gaze and military bearing suggested he'd handled similar situations before. We're conducting a sweep, but for your safety and that of your staff, you need to clear the premises now. James felt the absurdity of the moment crash over him like a cold wave. Agent Collins, I've been the mayor of this city for 15 years. I know every inch of this building. There is no basement. There are no militants. Someone has fed you false information. Sir, I understand your position, but we have to treat every credible threat seriously. The caller provided specific details about weapons, meeting times, and locations. We can't take chances with public safety. Agent Collins' tone remained professional, but his hand rested near his sidearm. Please gather your essential belongings and exit through the rear entrance. We'll escort you to a secure location. The evacuation felt like a perp walk. James gathered files with trembling hands while armed agents watched his every movement. Staff members whispered among themselves as they filed out, their expressions mixing confusion with the terrible awareness that their mayor stood accused of harboring terrorists. Mrs. Peterson from accounting kept glancing at James with barely concealed fear, as if he might suddenly reveal himself as a dangerous radical she'd never recognized. Outside, media vans had multiplied like a plague. Reporters thrust microphones toward James as he emerged under armed escort, their questions overlapping in a cacophony of accusation, disguised as journalism. Mayor Washington, how long have you been harboring militants? Do you have ties to domestic terror organizations? What's your response to allegations of weapons stockpiling? James raised his hand for silence, a gesture that had commanded respect in countless council meetings, but seemed powerless against the media frenzy. I categorically deny these baseless accusations. City Hall has no basement. We harbor no militants. Someone has deliberately provided false information to law enforcement. and we will cooperate fully to uncover the truth." His words felt hollow against the backdrop of armored vehicles and soldiers with assault rifles. Truth seemed fragile compared to the spectacle unfolding around him, the visual evidence of a crisis that existed only in someone's malicious imagination. The search of City Hall took 4 hours. Teams of agents swept every room, every closet, every storage area. They drilled through concrete floors, searching for hidden spaces that existed only in Karen's fabricated tip. Bomb-sniffing dogs found nothing more threatening than Rosa's forgotten lunch in her desk drawer. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what architectural records had already shown. The building sat on solid concrete, with no basement, no secret chambers, no hidden armories. But the damage was spreading beyond the building's confines. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories and political accusations. Local businesses reported customers staying away from downtown, afraid of potential violence. Parents kept children home from schools within a 5-mile radius. The city's economic life ground to a halt as fear spread through the community like wildfire. James watched the investigation from a conference room at the police station, where he'd been relocated for his protection. Through bulletproof windows, he could see his city transforming into something unrecognizable. Military checkpoints had appeared at major intersections. Helicopters maintained constant surveillance overhead. The mayor of a quiet suburban community had become a refugee in his own city. "The search has concluded," Agent Collins announced, entering the conference room with an expression that might have been apologetic, if not for his professional training. "No weapons, no militants, no evidence of any terrorist activity. We found exactly what you said we'd find. Nothing." Relief flooded through James like a physical sensation, but it carried undertones of bitter anger. "So I can return to my office, resume normal operations." "Not quite yet. We need to determine who made the false report and why. Until we understand the motivation behind this incident, we can't rule out ongoing threats. The military presence will remain in place as a precautionary measure." The investigation into Karen's identity began with standard call tracing procedures, but it quickly revealed deeper layers of deception. The call had been made from a burner phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store whose security cameras had been mysteriously malfunctioning that week. Karen had planned meticulously, understanding that false terrorism reports triggered massive responses with minimal verification requirements. Detective Sarah Kim, assigned to the case, began mapping Karen's movements through the early morning hours. Traffic cameras placed her near City Hall at the reported time, but they also showed something else. Karen's car had been parked near a warehouse on the industrial side of town just hours before her 911 call. The same warehouse featured in the background of several social media photos depicting armed militants in tactical gear. "We need to check that warehouse," Detective Kim told Agent Collins as they reviewed the footage. "If she's using it as a staging area for fake evidence, we might find our smoking gun there." The warehouse belonged to Millbrook Industrial Storage, a company owned by Thomas Whitfield, Karen's cousin. The same Thomas Whitfield who'd been quietly purchasing distressed properties throughout the downtown area over the past 6 months, taking advantage of low prices caused by economic uncertainty. The same Thomas Whitfield whose development company had submitted preliminary plans for a massive mixed-use complex that would require the demolition of several historic buildings, including the current City Hall. Inside the warehouse, investigators found props worthy of a Hollywood production: military uniforms, replica weapons, tactical gear, and professional photography equipment. A staging area had been constructed to look like an underground meeting space, complete with maps and planning documents. Karen had photographed accomplices posing as militants, creating evidence of terrorist activity that existed only in her imagination. She's been planning this for months, Detective Kim observed, photographing the elaborate setup, creating fake evidence, establishing a false narrative, all to justify a military response that would destabilize the city government. But the warehouse discovery revealed only the first layer of Karen's scheme. Financial records subpoenaed from Thomas Whitfield's companies showed a web of interconnected investments and planned developments that would benefit enormously from City Hall's relocation. Property values in the historic downtown district had already plummeted 30% since the morning's events. Insurance claims were being filed by businesses forced to close during the military occupation. The economic foundation of James's carefully managed city was cracking under the pressure of manufactured crisis. Karen had calculated that a terrorism scare would force the city to relocate its offices, abandon downtown development restrictions, and create opportunities for massive profit through strategic real estate manipulation. She'd weaponized fear and prejudice, using them as tools in a scheme that would have enriched her family while destroying a community. The second twist emerged from intercepted communications between Karen and her cousin, recorded by federal surveillance equipment that had been monitoring the situation since morning. NSA analysts, initially searching for real terrorist communications, had instead discovered a conspiracy of greed disguised as public safety concerns. The nigger mayor won't know what hit him. Karen's voice crackled through speakers in the FBI field office, captured in a phone call made just 2 hours after her false 911 report. By the time they realize there's nothing there, the damage will be done. Property values crashed, business confidence destroyed, city government in chaos. Tom can buy up half the downtown for pennies on the dollar. What if they trace it back to us? Thomas Whitfield's voice, nervous and uncertain, revealed the cracks in their conspiracy. They won't. I covered my tracks perfectly. Besides, who's going to believe a terrorist sympathizer over a concerned citizen reporting suspicious activity? The beauty of this plan is that it doesn't matter if they prove the tip was false. The damage is already done. Agent Collins played the recording for James in the police station conference room, watching the mayor's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally, a cold determination that spoke of justice demanded rather than mercy requested. She called in a terrorism threat against me because I'm black, James said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of pain that had accumulated over decades of fighting prejudice, disguised as legitimate concern. She risked the safety of this entire community, traumatized thousands of people, wasted massive government resources, and damaged our local economy because she saw an opportunity to profit from racial fear. The evidence is overwhelming. Agent Collins confirmed. We have her voice on the 911 recording, her car on traffic cameras, her presence at the warehouse, financial records linking her to the development scheme, and intercepted communications proving premeditation and racial motivation. This isn't just filing a false police report. This is domestic terrorism, conspiracy, hate crime charges, and about 12 other federal offenses. But Karen's scheme had one final phase that even federal investigators hadn't anticipated. As news of the false report began to circulate, she appeared on local television as a concerned citizen, questioning the thoroughness of the investigation. I saw what I saw, she told Channel 7 News, her performance pitch perfect for the camera. Just because they didn't find anything today doesn't mean those people weren't there yesterday. Maybe they moved the weapons when they realized they'd been discovered. Maybe this investigation isn't looking hard enough at the right people. Her appearance on television meant to muddy the waters and maintain public suspicion. Instead, provided the final piece of evidence investigators needed. Voice analysis software matched her television interview to the 911 recording with 99 99.7% certainty. Her attempt to extend the deception had confirmed her identity beyond any reasonable doubt. The confrontation came during an emergency city council meeting called to address the crisis. James had insisted on holding the session, despite federal recommendations to maintain security restrictions. "This is still America," he'd argued. "Our community deserves transparency about what happened to them today." The council chambers overflowed with residents seeking answers. Military vehicles remained visible through the windows, a constant reminder of the morning's chaos. Television cameras captured every word as James addressed his constituents with the dignity that had defined his long career. "Today our community was attacked," he began, his voice steady, despite the emotional undertow of betrayal and vindication. "Not by foreign terrorists or domestic militants, but by greed disguised as civic concern, by prejudice masquerading as public safety, by someone who was willing to terrorize an entire city for personal profit." Agent Collins took the podium next, outlining the evidence against Karen Whitfield and her cousin Thomas. As he spoke, federal marshals positioned themselves near the chamber doors, preparing for arrests that would conclude one of the most elaborate false terrorism reports in recent history. Karen sat in the third row, her face a mask of concern that might have convinced observers, if not for the federal surveillance team monitoring her every expression through high-definition cameras. She'd attended the meeting to maintain her pose as a concerned citizen, unaware that investigators had been tracking her movements since dawn. "Karen Whitfield," Agent Collins announced, his voice cutting through the chamber's tense atmosphere. "You are under arrest for filing false terrorism reports, conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism, hate crime charges, wire fraud, and inciting public panic. You have the right to remain silent." The arrest played out with dramatic inevitability. Karen's mask of civic concern cracked as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, revealing the furious entitlement beneath her performance. "This is ridiculous," she shouted as marshals escorted her through the chamber. "I was trying to protect this community. You should be thanking me, not arresting me." Her cousin Thomas was arrested simultaneously at his office across town, where investigators found additional evidence of the conspiracy, including detailed financial projections showing expected profits from downtown property acquisition following a municipal crisis. The community's response to Karen's exposure was swift and decisive. Business owners who'd suffered losses during the day's crisis filed civil suits seeking damages. The city council voted unanimously to ban both Karen and Thomas from all municipal property for life. Federal prosecutors announced they would seek the maximum penalties available under domestic terrorism statutes, including asset forfeiture that would claim the very properties Karen had hoped to profit from. But the healing process required more than legal consequences. James spent the following weeks visiting every neighborhood affected by the crisis, listening to residents' concerns, and rebuilding trust that had been damaged by the manufactured emergency. He met with parents whose children had been terrified by news reports, business owners facing financial losses, and community members struggling to understand how their peaceful city had become the target of such malicious deception. "What happened today wasn't about me," he told a gathering at St. Mark's Baptist Church a week after Karen's arrest. "It was an attack on all of us, on the community we've built together, on the values that make Millbrook home. But we've survived it, and we've emerged stronger because we've seen what we're truly made of when crisis tests us." The federal investigation revealed the scope of Karen's planning extended far beyond a single false report. She'd spent months studying emergency response protocols, researching terrorism reporting procedures, and identifying the precise combination of racial fear and security concerns that would trigger maximum government response. Her scheme represented a calculated weaponization of post-9/11 security infrastructure for personal profit. The prosecution team built their case methodically, assembling evidence that painted Karen's actions as premeditated domestic terrorism. The false report had cost federal agencies over $2 million in emergency response resources. Local businesses reported combined losses exceeding $5 million from the single day of crisis. The psychological impact on community members, particularly children who'd witnessed military occupation of their city, would require months of counseling and support. Karen's trial became a national symbol of how racial prejudice could be manipulated for personal gain in the modern era. Civil rights organizations highlighted the case as an example of weaponized emergency services, while law enforcement agencies studied her methods to prevent similar incidents. The intersection of racism, greed, and terrorism fears created a perfect storm of malicious opportunity that Karen had exploited with chilling effectiveness. The sentencing hearing drew national attention. Federal Judge Margaret Stone listened to impact statements from dozens of community members before delivering a verdict that would resonate far beyond Millbrook's borders. Karen Whitfield, you have committed one of the most calculated and destructive acts of domestic terrorism this court has encountered, Judge Stone declared, her words carrying the weight of justice too long delayed. You weaponized fear and prejudice against an entire community for personal profit. You traumatized children, destroyed businesses, wasted critical emergency resources, and attempted to destroy the reputation of a public servant whose only crime was serving his community with distinction while being black. The sentence reflected the severity of Karen's crimes: 25 years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture, including her home and investments, restitution payments totaling over $7 million, and a permanent ban from social media platforms that had amplified her deceptions. Thomas Whitfield received 15 years for his role in the conspiracy, along with forfeiture of his development company and all associated properties. But the true measure of justice came in the community's response to the crisis. Property values in downtown Millbrook recovered within 6 months, driven by residents' determination not to let fear control their city's future. New businesses opened to replace those that had closed during the crisis, many owned by entrepreneurs specifically attracted to a community that had demonstrated resilience against hatred. James Washington was re-elected mayor by the largest margin in city history, receiving support from voters who recognized his grace under pressure and commitment to justice over vengeance. His inaugural speech for his 4th term referenced the crisis that had tested their community's character. Democracy survives when good people refuse to let evil triumph through intimidation, he said, standing before a crowd that included federal agents, former critics who'd been converted by his leadership during crisis, and families whose faith in their community had been restored through collective action. We've proven that lies cannot destroy truth, that fear cannot overcome love, that greed cannot defeat justice when people of goodwill stand together. The military vehicles and helicopters had long since departed, leaving behind a community that understood itself more clearly than before. The crisis had revealed both the fragility and the strength of democratic institutions, the power and the limits of fear as a political weapon, the enduring relevance of racial prejudice disguised as security concerns. Sandra Washington had returned to her art classes, where students now painted scenes of hope and renewal instead of landscapes and flowers. Mrs. Henderson had indeed mastered perspective, finding in her brushstrokes a way to process the emotions that had overwhelmed their peaceful city. Art, she discovered, could transform trauma into beauty, fear into understanding, division into unity. The empty lot where Thomas Whitfield's development company had planned its profit-driven complex became a community garden, tended by volunteers from every neighborhood in Millbrook. Children played where weapons were supposed to have been cached. Flowers bloomed where militants were alleged to have plotted. And life continued with the stubborn persistence that defeat hatred in all its forms. On quiet mornings, before the demands of governing reclaimed his attention, James Washington still stood at his office window with coffee in hand, watching his city wake up to another day of peaceful democracy. The view looked exactly as it had before. Karen's phone call shattered their normalcy. But everything had changed. Trust had been tested and proven stronger than deception. Community bonds had been strained, but not broken. Justice had prevailed, not through vengeance, but through the patient work of people who refused to let evil triumph over good. The helicopters were gone, but their memory remained as a reminder of what could be lost when fear overcame reason, when prejudice masqueraded as protection, when greed disguised itself as civic duty. Millbrook had survived its siege not through military might, but through the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose truth over lies, unity over division, hope over fear. In the end, that had proven stronger than all the weapons Karen could have imagined, more powerful than any threat she could have fabricated, more enduring than any profit she could have gained. The city slept peacefully now, secure in the knowledge that democracy, like truth, required defense, but could not be destroyed by those too small to understand its power.